I have great pleasure in welcoming everyone to this public lecture of the G20 series of lectures. We have the great pleasure of having with us today Professor Walter Russell Mead. I'll introduce him later. And the topic of today's lecture is Emerging Geopolitics and India-US Relations, Challenges and Opportunities. Professor Mead is currently James Clark Chase Professor of Foreign Affairs and the Humanities, Bard College, New York. He was the Henry A. Kissinger Senior Fellow for US Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is currently a Distinguished Fellow in American Strategy and Statesmanship at the Hudson Institute. He is the author of several books, some of which I cite here. God and Gold, Britain, America and the Making of the Modern World, which is a very interesting book. Power, Terror, Peace and War, America's Grand Strategy in a World at Risk, and Special Providence, American Foreign Policy and How It Changed the World, which was published in 2001. In February 2018, he was named Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal. He writes articles, books, reviews and op-ed pieces for Foreign Affairs and other magazines and newspapers. So I very warmly welcome Professor Mead. He had visited at last year and then we had discussions over several things, but today he was kind enough to agree to this public lecture on this very important topic. The topic of his lecture, Emerging Geopolitics and India-US Relations, is both interesting and relevant. The emerging geopolitics, as the topic says, is a very interesting one and it is a complex situation. The two most important elements of the emerging geopolitics today are, one of course the rise of China and the recent Chinese behavior, which is a relatively long-term thing, and I'm sure that Professor Mead will touch upon it in his lecture. Now China has in the post-2008 period come to the conclusion that it has now arrived and it no longer need to wait, hide its ability or bide its time, and quite clearly, especially in the Xi Jinping era, China has concluded that now it can assert itself and it can probably even try to create an alternative world order, alternative to the world order that came into existence in 1945. So that is the dominant fact, the long-term fact of the emerging geopolitics. But the other important fact which came into existence only last year is the war in Ukraine, which I would argue is not just a war in Ukraine, but in a sense it is a Russo-American war. It has grave geopolitical consequences. Quite clearly now, after the Second World War, again we have a situation in which Europe of course is feeling threatened, and the chances are that Europe will turn inward and it will try to secure its borders, enhance its military power, etc., etc. And of course there is also that very clear possibility that America will have to get more involved in Europe than what it was in the, say, last 20-30 years after the end of the Cold War. And the fact that Russia has emerged as a threat again to Europe and the West, and the Sino-Russian alliance, all these are very important factors of the emerging geopolitics. The weakening of Russia, one might say of course that it works only to the benefit of America, but in my opinion it works in multiple ways. It has created a great advantage for China, and in fact I would personally argue that it was probably a mistake of the American foreign policy to try to sort of isolate Russia after the disintegration of the USSR and sort of take the borders of the, or take the NATO to the borders of Russia. But whatever the reasons may have been behind this, the reality today is that now this Russo-American war in Ukraine has become very important, and this is likely to change the geopolitical scenario in certain fundamental ways. Now, what are the challenges and opportunities? Of course, I leave it entirely to Professor Walter Russell Mead to talk about. I don't want to preempt him. So once again, I welcome the audience warmly and also welcome Professor Mead and request him to proceed with his lecture.
Well, thank you very much, Ravi. It's great to see you again. I came to this museum, was about a year ago?
Yes.
And was fortunate enough to have a guided tour of the museum, which had just opened, and to see the Nehru Library. I'm very happy to be back this time. I've brought a few friends. I guess when we think about the world situation today, there's a tendency for people to see sort of two dimensions to international politics today. One is the rise of China, the other is the decline of the United States. And I hear this frequently from many people. And I guess maybe the thing to start with is to say that when someone tells me that the United States is in decline, I'm often skeptical, and I want to explain why. The reason is that the United States of America has been in decline my entire life. I am now 70 years old, and some of my first memories are back in the 1950s when the Russians put the Sputnik satellite up before and when the Americans couldn't have any satellites. And there was this panic that swept the United States. Oh my gosh, the Russians they're better than us at math. We can't teach our children anything. They actually made me study Venn diagrams in the first grade. They were trying to get American kids to learn math because we were so far behind the Russians. Then in 1960, President Kennedy ran for election on the platform of the missile gap. The Russians were ahead of the United States in outer space. We were doomed. The Russians were really eating our lunch. Almost right after that came the panic. Oh my gosh, where we have the balance of payments deficit. Bretton Woods will be destroyed, the fixed exchange rates, and when that's over, the United States is finished forever. Then the civil rights revolution. America is so torn by internal dissent. And we had far worse riots in the 1960s than anything we've seen today. At one point, 100 people were killed in fighting in Detroit, and the National Guard came in on tanks. So America was totally in decline. And if that wasn't enough, we had the Vietnam War, which first divided Americans even more deeply. And then we were defeated in Vietnam. We lost the Vietnam War. The Vietnam syndrome will forever prevent America from acting internationally again. And America has lost its innocence. We've lost the respect of every country in the world. America is finished. But we had barely recovered from that when it was Watergate. And again, the foundations of American democracy have been destroyed. It's all over. Then in the 1970s, some of us are old enough to remember, the Soviet Union is back on the march. All of Africa is falling to the Soviet Union. America can't compete in Africa. It's the end. It's over. Then the Iranian hostage crisis. America helpless, ridiculous. Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. It's all over. Then it was, and Germany and Japan are the real winners. They are the new economies. Japan is going to be the economy of the future. It's leaving America behind in technology. I could go on. Iraq War. It's been 70 bitter, remorseless, unending years of decline. All right? But as George Orwell once said about fascism, he said, the dark night of fascism is always falling on America, but landing in Europe. And In the same way, it seems to me that the dark night of decline is always falling on America but landing somewhere else. So when I hear people today telling me that America is in decline, it's lost its dynamism, China is the country of the future, I want them first to explain to me why so many people have thought this in the past and been wrong, and then show me why this time is different, and then I'll listen to you. But for now, when I hear these very learned, very wise, very factual accounts of American decline, I'm just a little bit suspicious. And I'm also a little bit suspicious about China's rise. But let me go on to say, what is it that this declining, doddering America actually wants in the world? Because I think there is often a lot of confusion about what American foreign policy is about. A great deal of confusion, by the way, in the minds of Americans, not just of others. And you'll hear people say, well, America is basically an isolationist country and is always ready to end its engagement with the rest of the world. Some people say, no, America is a relentlessly imperialist country, bent on conquering the world and so on. But as a student of history, when I look at American strategy, national strategy, and I look not so much at what this politician says or what that politician says, but what Americans have done over the centuries at this point, it does seem to me that there is a kind of a pattern here. And it's both a geopolitical realist policy, but there is a values component to it as well, and an economic component. It's important to see how these things fit and sometimes don't fit together. Basically, American geopolitical strategy wants to see a balance of power in Europe, a balance of power in Asia, no country other than the United States able to dominate the Middle East. And then from there, we're okay. The assumption being that that only a country that dominated Europe, as the Soviet Union tried in the Cold War, as Germany tried in the 1940s, could be a threat to America at home. And in the same way, only a country like, well, the Soviet Union tried at one point to dominate Asia, obviously Japan before that. But if you go even earlier, Americans actually opposed British colonialism in Asia out of a fear that Britain would dominate East Asia the way it did South Asia and limit American prosperity and security. We actually extended the Monroe Doctrine to Hawaii in the 1840s in order to prevent Hawaii falling to British colonialism. We wanted it to be part of the United States, and I'm glad it is. So that's really the kind of bread and butter of American national geopolitical strategy right there. And you can see that if we just look at East Asia, in the 19th century, the United States opposed British colonialism. That's why we sent Commodore Perry to open up Japan in the 1850s, was in order to ensure that Japan would economically develop and engage with the world so that it wouldn't be a sitting duck for British colonialism. It's why we supported the open door in China. Again, we did not want to see China carved up into colonial possessions. Then when Japan emerged as a threat to the balance of power in Asia, the United States actually began to work with other countries against Japan. When Japan was defeated in 1845 and it looked as if a Sino-Soviet alliance was forming, the United States opposed that. And today we can see China emerging as a profound threat to the balance of power in Asia. And the United States is looking for allies, for partners, and looking for ways to cooperate with other countries against that threat. Very consistent line of policy. We sometimes pursue it energetically, We sometimes pursue it in a half-hearted way. We make a lot of mistakes, but it's pretty consistent over the centuries what we've tried to do. And again, in Europe, up until World War I, we sort of outsourced the job of balancing the power in Europe to the UK. And then in World War I, when Britain could no longer, even with France, balance Germany, the United States came into the rescue there, again in World War II. And during the Cold War, we worked to prevent the Soviet Union from extending its domination into Western Europe. All of this was related to concepts of American security, all of it pretty basic geopolitics, but it's a pretty consistent pattern of how we act. There is, however, a values dimension to this, in the sense that if you want to prevent one country from dominating a region, you are in effect saying you support the independence of the other countries in that region. So that if we wanted to prevent British colonialism from taking over East Asia, we worked with the Thais, we worked with the Chinese, we worked with the Japanese and the Koreans to try to prevent that colonial domination. Similarly against Japanese aggression and so on and so forth. Same thing in Europe. And so the American geopolitical ambition, in a way, not because we are such wonderful people, such moral people, but because it's sort of natural consequence of our geopolitical interests, often end up being the supporters of the independence of countries endangered by a hegemonic neighbor that wants to extend its power. And again, we see this in Asia today, where countries who are concerned potentially about excessive power from China turn to the United States as a kind of natural protector there. And American power, again, I don't say that we are kind or wise in the use of our power all the time. We're clearly not. But from the standpoint, if you're a Japan, or if you are a Vietnam today, you might worry that the United States could be too powerful, but even at its worst, a United States which is thousands of miles away across the ocean is less of a threat to your independence than an extremely powerful China right next door. And so there is a sense in which for Denmark, the United States at our worst will not threaten the independence of Denmark the way in the past Germany might, or during the Cold War the Soviet Union did. So the United States, in these times when the balance of power has become kind of unglued and an imbalance is erupting, the United States is always able to find eager and willing allies who share the interest, not because they love the United States, but because they want to protect their own independence. We find allies when the balance of power is threatened. Again, in things like the Quad and other things, we can see this phenomenon happening today. One thing that is characteristic also of American strategy is that in peacetime, in peace or war, we are trying to build a global economic system. Again, American interests, economic interests, we can't choose between Asia and Europe and the Western Hemisphere. Roughly a third of our trade is across the Atlantic. A third of our trade is north or south in our own hemisphere. A third of our trade is across the Pacific Ocean. So that we are not in a position to write off any part of the world economically. It all matters to us. And so following the British example, we have tried to keep the world sea lanes open for trade. We've tried to create a situation where countries can trade freely with one another, where investments can flow. which I think is good for the world economy. We've also seen it as good for the United States. We then do something a little bit odd, which is that when we have defeated a country, like we defeated Germany and Japan in 1945, we don't characteristically say, okay, now you've been bad and you must suffer. And so others can trade freely around the world, but you must stay in your little corner. We actually said to Germany and Japan after World War II, get rich. This world trading system, you can buy all the raw materials, all the copper in Chile, all the rubber in Malaya, and travel over oceans that are protected by the American Navy. You can then export cars and other things to the United States, even if it gives us a very large trade deficit, and even if it makes you rich, because we believe the chances are that if participation in this international system is making you rich, you will not challenge it. You will actually choose to support that system and see American goals as harmonizing with your own national economic goals. And this has obviously worked in the case of Japan and China and Germany after 1945. Now, after 1989, we made the same offer essentially to India and China and to Russia that had been made earlier. Trade in the world, get rich, and the hope was first of all that Russia would trade enough to get rich that it might change Russia. Russia, in a sense, failed to benefit from the economic system enough to become an engaged partner. And China, on the other hand, I think made the fundamental error of working in this international system to grow rich, but then instead of saying, oh, it's not actually such a bad system. Every year China gets richer and richer. Every year we have more and more respect. They say instead, a little bit like Kaiser Wilhelm I did in 1914, we must be number one. It is not enough for us to be a member of a successful economic order that enriches us more than other people. We must be the one that everyone bows to. We must have the seat of honor at all the feasts. We must be number one. And now the United States and other countries are having to deal with a China that is economically empowered as a result of its participation in this global economic system, but has determined that overturning that economic system and also overturning the balance of power in in Asia, is necessary to its own idea of its security. And the dilemma of American foreign policy today is, what do we do about this? And this is where India-US relations come in. Because the United States is now trying to come up with an approach to China. And what would that be? You hear a debate among two ideas in the US today. One of them is the idea that we should contain China. In other words, do with China what we tried to do and ultimately did with the Soviet Union, that by stopping its territorial expansion of communism, we believe that because communism is such a flawed economic system, Soviet communism, that if the Soviet Union couldn't continue expanding, ultimately the flaws of its system would cause it to sort of disintegrate from within. And in America, the view is this is more or less what happened. We were able to hold the line, prevent Soviet expansion into Europe, and as a result, the Soviet Union fell behind technologically, economically. Well, this is not necessarily going to work that well with China, because China has a lot of economic and technological dynamism, is integrated into the world economy in ways the Soviet Union would never do. So what's the alternative? it seems to me the alternative is not to try to contain China, certainly not to try to stop China from becoming richer. I don't like any kind of policy that depends on trying to make other human beings more miserable than they have to be. One can't, I think as a human being, one has to say that China's emergence from poverty into modernity is a good thing. When hundreds of millions of people leave absolute poverty behind, the human heart can't help but rejoice. So what do we do? Well, here's the answer. India, I think, is a large part of the answer. Because the problem in Asia is not that China is so much bigger than the rest of Asia, that China must inevitably dominate Asia unless the United States is fighting wars with it. Just the problem is that China developed faster than India. In 1980, India's economy was 64% of China's economy, the size of China's economy. Today, India's economy is more or less 17% of China's economy. And in that growing gap from 1980, we see the imbalance existing in Asian politics and economics. If India, which I think this month many believe is passing China to become the most populous country in the world, if India grows, the balance of Asia will be restored. That is, if India is a flourishing country with GDP rising to toward Chinese levels, Indian influence in Southeast Asia, in Sri Lanka, in the rest of Asia will be great, and it will be impossible for China to sort of brush it aside. But more than that, serious, intelligent people in Beijing thinking about Asia and China's place in the world will draw the inescapable conclusion that Asia is too big for even China to eat. China can't, dominating Asia is out of the question. China must must find a way to participate in a flourishing Asia that is bigger, because of course it won't just be India that flourishes, it'll be Vietnam, it will be Indonesia, which has a population of, 1/3 of China's. It will be a whole arc of countries where there is active economic development, strong national power. And this balance of power in Asia, a rebalance of power in Asia, it seems to me this is the job, this is the way for the United States to achieve our national interests. And it depends upon, above all, Indian economic success. That a flourishing India is the answer to America's China problem. Now this is, at best, this is a medium-term answer. The imbalance is real, and it creates a military imbalance and a political imbalance, and it tempts China to throw its weight about. So in the short term, partnerships like the Quad and other things are necessary while the imbalance persists to deter China from going on an even more unwise path than it has already chosen. But that is not the heart of the policy. The heart of the policy is to promote a flourishing India in a flourishing Asia in which there is a natural balance of power. And in that case, America's strategic and economic goals are reached in Asia, but at the same time, this is the framework, I believe, that for people not only in India but in the rest of Asia is most commensurate with human values. Because this is in a prosperous Asia, there is such a natural balance of power that war tends to recede to the margins as a possibility. So when I think about U.S.-India cooperation, I do think, particularly in the short term, about military dimension. There must be a military dimension to this. Because, well, I don't have to tell people who live in a country where sort of conflict exists on the frontiers that there is a real problem. And China, I was in Taiwan last fall and spoke to people who are frightened that some morning a Chinese invasion fleet will appear on their coast, or that China would try to starve Taiwan into submission with a military blockade. Those threats are real. We have to think about them. But this is ultimately not a partnership about military ends. It is a partnership about the growth of Asia. And so what I hope is that while, yes, we move ahead with military cooperation between the Americans, the Indians, the Japanese, the Australians, and many others, a growing number of others, we're also looking at is there anything that we can do in the United States that can help growth accelerate in India? How do we work to improve the flow of investment and technology? As so many countries now rethink their dependence on China for manufactured goods, for medical supplies that turned out in the pandemic not to be reliable, as different companies and countries move elements of their supply chains out of China, how can we make sure that this shift does the most possible to advance India's development, that India gains the best benefits out of this tremendous historic opportunity that it now has? So those are my basic thoughts about how U.S.-India cooperation, I think, is fundamental, not in order to build a war-fighting coalition against China, but to build a coalition that can avoid war with China. Sun Tzu, the great Chinese strategist from thousands of years ago, said the greatest general is the general who wins without fighting a battle. And that is the campaign I think the United States and India should embark on together, while making the prudential necessary steps in the short term to ensure that while this imbalance exists, it does not erupt into a war.
Thank you, Professor Mead, for that very insightful lecture. As you rightly pointed out, now China is the main factor, disruptive or whatever you call it, not just from the viewpoint of American geopolitical objectives, but also in terms of India-US relations. And for the American foreign policy, the primary objective, therefore, in the world today and in Asia today would be to help the rise of India further economically, technologically, and militarily. Now, as far as I can see, India-US relations, you used word like counterbalance and so on. We know that these words were being used for India vis-a-vis China even in the 1950s. During the tenure of President Truman, it was being thought that if we want to prevent the rise of communism in Asia further after the Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949, then India and the democratic way of life that it was demonstrating must be built up as an example. And the reality is that successive presidents of America did try to promote that policy. Of course, the success varied according to the context. Eisenhower played a very important role, especially during his second tenure. And then, of course, during the tenure of John F. Kennedy and the period when this Sino-Indian War also happened, this became a very, very important line of argument in America. And of course, a lot of cooperation, economic, military, technological, happened. From 1971 to not just the end of the Cold War, but till about 2000, till the tenure of Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, we had this almost 3-decade period, or at least a quarter century of a period, when that strategy was seemingly, though the relations between India and the US continued to be overall good, but there was some kind of a decline compared to the earlier period, primarily because of the China factor, because in its competition with Soviet Union during the Cold War, China became critical for United States geopolitics, and because there was a Sino-Soviet rift, and therefore, of course, America changed its policy, and that is the period when this strategy more or less went into the background. But then, in the last 20 years again, we can see that both in the American media, intelligentsia, and in India, there has been this point about India being the only country actually who can sort of balance the balance of power in Asia. And I remember reading these things even in the late 90s when, as you rightly said, the gap between India and China was comparatively very small economically. However, the fact is that now the gap has increased enormously, though I would contend that the gap is still not as big as it seems to be. If we look at it in purchasing power parity terms, then the Indian GDP is about $10 trillion and the Chinese GDP is $25 trillion. And of course, rather strangely, the American GDP is now less than the Chinese GDP at about $23 trillion. So the fact is that this thing, of course, has been there for very long. This fact that India is the only country, the most important country, that can, in a way, whatever you call it, not contain China, as you rightly said, but certainly create an acceptable balance of power system in Asia. But in the current scenario now, the gap between India and China, and the fact that there is a border there, there is a conflict there, do you think that in the foreseeable future, say in the next 10-20 years, this entire strategy of America will succeed? Do you think that Indian economic development, for example, will be able to catch up with China soon enough? Because there are internal factors also here, which are changing things. For example, we have what is called a demographic advantage now, demographic bonus, but it's not going to be there for very long. So do you think that India would be able to develop that fast in the next 10-20 years? And what would be the role of the United States in that development and overall building up of India?
Well, look, I think one of two things have changed. I've been talking mostly about what's going on in the United States, but I have been visiting India for some time, and I've seen changes here too. And I've seen two changes. One is a growing realization that India, as they say, has missed the bus. That the wave of rapid economic growth, of which China's success is the most visible, but that first came to countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, then you see Singapore, other countries getting on the bandwagon, that India did not achieve the kind of manufacturing export platform success that these countries did. And when I've talked to officials in the Indian government, when I've talked to experts in India, there's a growing sense we must not miss the bus again. And that the people understand that this shift of global supply chains away from China toward other destinations is the kind of opportunity that does not come twice in a lifetime. And when I look around India, what I see, I spent a lot of time in traffic jams on this visit to India. but not the same kind of traffic jams, or not the same cause. This time, often the traffic jams are caused because there are these huge highway building projects and infrastructure projects, and they're slowing traffic down temporarily. In the old days, it was just a traffic jam. So you can see visibly all over the country the signs that India this time is going to have the highways, the ports, the power generation capability, the national internal market, all of the other necessary building blocks for the kind of success that countries including China have had. So I am an optimist about the Indian economy, because it does seem to me that people in India do not want to miss this bus. Also, I would say that the remarkable achievements in digitalization, the building on India's extraordinary strength in IT and cyber, which at least in that one sector have elevated India absolutely to the front rank in the world, right? India has used that to create a national governance model, welfare service delivery, all of these other things that have put the Indian state in a very different and much stronger position, no matter what party is running it. Okay, so and there's a conviction now that's far deeper than it used to be in India, that both capitalism and international trade, while yes, they both are dangerous things that can have lots of consequences, they are necessary to Indian success and prosperity and national security. And that has changed thinking in India in many ways. The other thing is simply the fear of China is real. Everywhere I go in India, people want to talk about their concerns about what's happening on the frontier, what's happening in Sri Lanka, strings of pearls. This is not just a few elites in foreign policy think tanks or a few defense intellectuals. These are things that people think about, in their daily lives. So India has woken up in a way that I have not seen in my years of visiting. And I think, as far as I can tell, the country is moving it knows that it can't just sort of sit to one side and let others do, and just sort of in its own self-contained bubble, that India has to be a global success to maintain its own independence and security.
Thank you. We are now open to questions and comments, discussion. Yes.
Fascinating. I'm Suman Berry. I'm the vice chairman of something called Niti Aayog here. And one reaction and a couple of questions. The reaction is that I'm gratified to know that somebody like yourself, who is a security and foreign policy specialist, sees economics at the heart of the relationship. The questions are, Robert Blackwell, when he was ambassador, talked about the economic relationship being as flat as a chapati, and that's 20 years ago. Well, the two questions. One is that I've done a lot of work on and in Europe, and I think in Europe there is quite a strong degrowth mentality, that essentially the future of the planet cannot support another China, India could be another China, and that therefore, as it were, India's rise is not necessarily, from all kinds of points of view, employment. So my first question is that a sentiment in the United States? How divided are thoughts on this when Mr. Kerry comes visiting? What should be India's reaction to this? And secondly, what would be the machinery of deeper engagement between India and China, given India and sorry, the US, given, as it were, both the space available in the Congress to the Biden administration, but more importantly, given his attitude on trade, on subsidies. So is this just a hiccup, or does this represent deeper forces that might get in the way of the kind of engagement that, frankly, China has with the U.S.?
Well, yeah, those are actually excellent questions, and they get to the heart of a lot of the dynamics of what's going on in the world. You're mentioning Secretary Kerry reminds me of something the Israelis used to say when he was doing negotiations there with the Obama administration. They'd say, won't somebody please give John Kerry his Nobel Prize so he'll go home? And, that may be a sentiment shared by some others. On the whole fundamental question of growth in the world economy and, let's say, the natural environment, I must say I am not a Malthusian. I do not believe, what Paul Ehrlich wrote in 1979, The Population Bomb, and he said, the only solution is for 100 million Indians to die of starvation or something of that kind. Because, the world's population grows faster than the world's food supply, and it turns out it doesn't.
Gunnar Myrdal.
Yes, exactly. And this kind of Malthusian thinking is popular, and it's always popular among certain types of intellectuals and stand-pat people. I believe that the solution to climate change, it does not involve a lot of bureaucrats writing long memos to each other and jetting to conferences first in this country and then in that country. I go to Davos every year, and one of the most amazing things you see are the fleets of private jets bearing billionaires to Davos to give the world lectures on reducing our consumption for carbon change, for climate change. I think it's going to be a combination of things. I think we will find, human beings are smart, and we are active, and when we have incentives and an enterprise system, we will come up with new technologies. People used to literally worry that cities could not keep growing because the amount of horse manure that would fall on city streets in order to bring all the food and so on in that the inhabitants of the cities need would soon be so great it couldn't be cleared away, and the cities would suffocate in horse manure on the streets. And then came cars. So I believe that we are moving toward a different kind of economy, a different kind of fuel system. I also think, by the way, that the information revolution changes. I work from home now several days a week. Started during the pandemic, but I've kept doing it, as have many others in America. The measurable reduction in emissions caused by things like working from home is quite serious. So I don't think that the long-term, I think the European degrowth mentality and those in America who share it are basically wrong. And that over time, as we've seen with other panics, the panic will subside because the technological change will happen. And it's already beginning. So in the meantime, however, I think India does have to face, look, many Europeans, I think, in a way, use climate change as as a way to justify protectionism. And so, I'm not actually trying to save the French steel industry from Indian competition. I'm trying to save the planet. I'm a good person, not a selfish person. And you have a lot of that going on there. And you have some of it also happening in the United States. It needs to be fought. But I think, again, the combination of, we need India to develop. a war with China would be bad for the environment. Wars are not good for green things. So, there's such a common sense basis to this. I think we're gonna work it out.
Yeah, it's so important you said that we need India to develop, because the success of India story, the eradication of poverty in this country, the development of India, India becoming a prosperous nation is in the interest of the entire world, and it is critical for the world today.
Exactly.
So, those people in Europe or in other parts of the world who think that we have to sort of reduce carbon footprint, we have to save environment, etc., they are all right. Of course, environment has to be saved and unnecessary consumerism has to be reduced. But the fact is that it cannot be done at the cost of a developing country like India, which is still at a relatively lower stage of development. It has to develop, of course, only then can it achieve its potential. And soon India is going to overtake China as the most populous nation of the world. So after all, what will happen if the most populous nation of the world remains poor and underdeveloped simply because there are fears about environmental degradation, etc.? It's not going to work.
Now, to talk practically about how do we work on these things, one thing it strikes me is that we need to speed up the flow of investment, of market-driven investment into India. And to do that, we need to understand, because so much, there's an element of this that is national policy in India, but there's also each state. And in the Indian system, I am learning, the state governments actually control many of the critical things like labor legislation, some elements of the land system, and so on. So, there's each Indian state needs to take stock of what it can do independently of the center.
All I can say is that's our job.
Yes, right. But I think it can also be helpful for American investors and others in the U.S. who now take a strategic interest in the Indian economy to work with the state governments and others. So we need to broaden out the cooperation.
Professor Mead, there is a comment from there. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Mead, for a brilliant talk on American strategy and India, of course. I have two questions. One is related to the economics, and the other, of course, to the American strategy. When the China and the other Southeast Asian countries were started industrializing in 80s and 90s, it sort of coincided with a period of deindustrialization in the West, and which was a conscious decision taken by the West at that particular time. Now the West, again, of course, America is rethinking of reindustrialization using the AI technologies. So in that context, really, how are you going to help India, when you yourself are trying to reindustrialize yourself, and, and you're not at the moment as economically powerful as you were then in the 80s and 90s, and the Wall Street was rising. The Wall Street never had any challenge in the 80s. Now the Silicon Valley, which is the leading the capitalist order, is basically now has a strong challenge from China, especially now. Mm-hmm. So in that context, how are you going to help India? Is there a clear-cut path which you have laid out to help India? The second question, of course, relates to strategy. During the Cold War, the consistent feature of the American strategy was to create a Sino-Soviet split, not to let Eurasia combine. Now we see Eurasia getting combined again. Now we see, so do you think the Ukraine war is going to help America achieve that Sino-Russian split again? Are you going to get Russia closer to the West again now?
May I introduce Dr. Atul Bharadwaj? He is a fellow here at NMML. Dr. Atul Bharadwaj. Yes, you can respond now.
Thank you. Look, I think on the economic side, I would say that what we're seeing is, yes, America actually never deindustrialized. If you look at the value added in manufacturing, it's much greater now than it was in the 1970s. It's just that the manufacturing that remained in the U.S. was much more automated, and so it took many fewer human hands to create manufactured products. So manufacturing employment has fallen dramatically, but value added in manufacturing, the sector has actually grown. Now that's going to continue, I think, regardless of everything else. When we talk about reshoring today and bringing more production back on shore, part of this is strategic in the sense that, you know, we discovered during the pandemic that if you don't make your own masks or whatever, other countries might suddenly not be willing to ship them. So many countries are thinking, okay, we have to retain certain capacities. Now there's an economic cost to that, but that is not the whole economy, all right? And if we think, if, let us say, something like $1 trillion worth of annual trade that now is based in China is going to not be based in China 5 or 10 years from now. All right, some of that might go to reshoring in the United States, but others will go elsewhere. So in a sense, this is a source of the opportunity and a shape of the opportunity for a country like India. Machiavelli said that you grow weak by giving away your own possessions to others, but you grow strong by giving away the possessions of others. And so in this sense, you know, it's how do we divide up the trade that formerly went to China? And there's the Indian proposition. In terms of strategy, again, could you remind me what the...
One of the consistent features of the American strategy was to cause the Sino-Soviet split. So are you relying on the same split strategy now to break China and Russia?
Every American president since George W. Bush has longed to as they say, peel Russia from China. So Bush looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul. Obama begins with the reset button. Trump thinks, I can do business with Putin. And the Biden administration started by trying to reach some kind of accommodation. At some point, even Americans have to learn to take no for an answer. All right? And, you know, the answer is that I think as long as Putin views America as stronger than China, he will tilt toward China. On the day he begins to think China has become stronger than the United States, he will tilt away from China. If I could sum up what I think is Putin's geopolitical dream, he would like to repeat Stalin's success, who first sided with Germany in World War II and got a price for that, the Baltics and half of Poland, then sided with America against Germany and got an even bigger price for that. Putin would like to get a price from the East and a price from the West. Unfortunately, I think Russia may not succeed in this. Now, I don't see any winners in the war in Ukraine. It's not a war the United States wanted to see, and it is a war that distracts us from worries in Taiwan and elsewhere. From an American point of view, the sooner that war ends, the better. But at the same time, one doesn't want it to end in a Russian victory. What that means, we don't know. We are all now basically waiting on the God of battles to see what the outcome will look at. And we all know in the first week of the war, everybody thought, oh, Russia would win for sure. Then the opinion turned, oh, Ukraine is winning and nothing can stop it. Then, oh, Russia is now grinding them to pieces. Then Ukraine is winning, Russia is winning. So the conventional wisdom in war always goes wildly from side to side, and everyone is always very sure. The one thing we know about war is that it's not predictable. And we will have to, we have to see where this one ends. I don't think it ends, again, we would have been better to deter Putin from fighting the war than anything else. And that is also, we don't want to win a war with China over Taiwan. We want to prevent China, to deter China from attacking Taiwan. And that's where you win or lose these things, is deterrence, especially in a nuclear age.
Yes, please. He's Professor Indivar Kamtekar. He's
So,
a senior fellow
I'm a
here
fellow of
at
the institution.
historian, eminent historian.
Well, no, I enjoyed the presentation, but there are a couple of things. One is that you spoke about America in decline from the 50s, and obviously there's been a lot of self-flagellation, let's say, from Sputnik to Vietnam to Watergate. The difference is now that a lot of the rest of the world is seeing America in decline. Earlier, that wasn't the case. So this is a fundamental difference. The other thing which I must say, you stressed that India's economic growth has been slow. That's certainly true. It's also been true that the political independence of India has been relatively high over the last few decades, over the last several decades. And while the fear of China is real, the fear of the American embrace is also there. And where that reassurance is going to come from is not as clear as perhaps it might be. But the question I have is this, that how would you compare, looking at it structurally, how would you compare the Chinese presence in American life, consumer goods, whatever else, so many parameters, with the Indian presence, emigration and so on and so forth, people presence, consumer goods, whatever. And what I'm asking you then is to lay out, if you would, what are the possible domestic constraints on the way American policy will evolve or be influenced as far as the two countries are concerned? What are the domestic constraints rather than the geostrategic kind of axiom that India should balance China?
All right, well, in the first instance, I would actually say that, my memory of the last 70 years is that during most of the time I was hearing nonstop from foreigners about American decline. That, you can read the European press for the last 70 years, and it's an unbroken story of how the, sort of 10 years of America in decline, followed by 6 weeks of, they're taking over the world, followed by 10 years of American decline. And one can go back and read all of the stuff about how American consumer society is falling apart, the rottenness. I would actually say it's a universal perception that America is in decline, occasionally punctuated by moments of, wait a minute, what are these people up to? But in any case, I would say, if America is in decline, you have nothing to fear from an American economic embrace. It's only the hypothesis that America is resilient that one would worry. But again, I don't think, I look at, has Japan been weakened by the American economic embrace? Very few Japanese would say so. Has Germany been weakened by embracing the United States? Germany is surely more independent and in fact larger as a result of its embrace of the United States. The European Union's relations, France has been in no way diminished by these embraces. I think economic exchanges are not so much one party takes everything and the other ends up with nothing. So I would argue that in fact India stands to gain more by economic cooperation with the United States that builds the size of the Indian economy, that accelerates the development of Indian technology, increases India's independence and standing and options rather than diminishing them. That would be my view. But I'm sure we could have an interesting conversation about it. And have I answered your question, or was there another piece of it?
No, the question was, what are the domestic
domestic constraints.
How do you compare how
very
China relates to America in terms of
It's
various
interesting.
parameters with how India relates to America?
China is a much bigger actor on Wall Street than India, but India is a much greater actor in America than China. And the reason is, I think, while we have significant Chinese migration to the United States, the Indian-American community has emerged as, well, it is believed to be the single wealthiest ethnic community in the United States. and has a political profile. There are no Chinese American politicians who have this, who have the standing of a Nikki Haley or a Kamala Harris. Indians are perhaps not as excited by Kamala Harris as they were at one point. Americans aren't either. But the sort of, on the other hand, when I teach in college, I almost invariably have a lot of Chinese students. It's unusual to have an Indian student. So that far more, I think we have 200,000 before COVID, about 200,000 plus Chinese students in the United States, much smaller number of Indian students. So there are ways, the two presences in American life are quite different. There is a much larger Chinese economic lobby, pro-China economic lobby, than pro-India economic lobby. But the trouble is that the pro-security lobby is stronger than the pro-China lobby. And if you sit down and you talk to George Soros about what is his biggest fear, it's China. And if you sit down and you talk to people on the far right, what is your greatest international fear? It's China. So that Xi Jinping has united Americans. He's very successful in that way. And India in the United States has a much more favorable profile. I am not aware of anti-Indian sentiment as a sort of element of American media coverage or this and that. It's seen as a friendly country and a nice people.
Is it a more expendable profile?
Expandable?
Expendable.
No, in the sense, again, as the American concern about China leads some people fast who are students of international affairs and study these things very quickly move to India. Others who think less frequently move more slowly, but they move.
Professor, I don't want to hog this, but the point is, if we matter because of China, and China matters because of China, then we have a problem.
Well, not, only to the point where between us, and where India has become so wealthy and strong, that China is no longer a problem, by which point you don't need that, because your own position in the world means that people will pay you due heed and respect because of what you are.
Sure, let's leave it
I think what was meant was, of course, that India is important for the United States in its own right, obviously, but as a matter of the current geopolitics or the geostrategy, of course, this was an important factor. If I may just mention, we had organized a lecture recently of Dr. Tanvi Madan, and she has written that famous book, The Fateful Triangle, the relations with India, China and the US, and she has argued there how China was actually the dominant factor and has not been recognized in shaping the India-US relations, not just during the Cold War, but even later. So I think maybe you meant it from that point of view, of course, that the rise of China and the fact that now it is threatening to disrupt the world order is something that has to be reckoned with. But of course, the relations between India and US, in fact, United States played an important role even during the freedom struggle of America, and there was so much goodwill in the US about American freedom. Especially President Roosevelt supported Indian freedom very strongly, as we are all aware of. So certainly one can say that one has to say rather that India-US relations stand in their own right. Any other question? Yes, please go ahead.
Just an observation and, on this point. Someone this week said to us that sharing democratic systems won't create a strategic convergence, but a strategic convergence will be greatly enhanced by shared democratic institutions. And so I think that as a result of the coming together because of China, the United States and India are going to discover a lot of things about each other that they like, and that's going to have a kind of dynamic all its own. And one other thing, I think India has Indian culture has a very high profile in the United States, from food to spirituality to fashion, Bollywood, all of these things, and that shouldn't. I don't think that should be discounted either. In the same way that it's not going to create a strategic convergence, but it's going to help make it feel good.
After having lived in Jackson Heights for many years, I think India's profile, at least in New York, is pretty high.
Yes, there was.
I want to ask you, how do you read the recent geopolitical development where China is pushing two rival countries, Iran and Saudi Arabia, towards normalization?
Well, I would argue that China probably didn't push. There's several things. Middle East is infamously complicated, but in general, I think part of what's going on with the Saudis is that the Saudis and the Biden administration really don't have a very good relationship. In fact, it's a terrible relationship, and so some of this is the Saudis just the United States was also hoping to get some kind of Saudi-Iranian agreement. The Biden administration working on it. If they had wanted to, they could have had those negotiations in Washington, or maybe with Iran, not in Washington, but somewhere, and they could have given Washington credit. There was no substantive difference between the rather hollow and empty agreement that the two have signed than the one that the Biden administration would have liked them to sign. So this is not, China has acquired such power in the Middle East that it's changing the behavior of Middle Eastern countries. It is that Middle Eastern countries are using the dynamics of the U.S.-China relationship both to enhance their bargaining position with the United States and to deliver a slap in the face of a president that they don't like. And we will see, I think it's very unlikely. The Saudis, the maximum thing they've done is they've gone back to where they were to 2016 when they had diplomatic relations and hated each other cordially. So this is not a real change in the Middle East, nor does it really represent a change in China's role in the Middle East. It represents, it's more a PR, public relations kind of trick. But we should not, where we should understand is that China is looking for ways to increase its profile in the Middle East and to build new relationships, and it will work on that. Most alarming to me, frankly, is the Russian-Iranian cooperation and the sort of deepening alliance of Russia, Iran, and China that I think could really lead to some kind of crisis. Russia has announced it's delivering new sophisticated aircraft to Israel. There comes a point where Israeli fears of the Iranian nuclear program reach a point where they will feel they have to act. And again, if you were Putin and you wanted to make the United States as miserable as possible and to make the Europeans pay as high a price as possible for their opposition to you in Ukraine, and also to enjoy the highest possible price for oil, whomping up a nice little war in the Middle East would be an excellent way to do it, or even just building a crisis. So what I fear the most in the Middle East is Israel being forced into a position where it sees no option but actually to attack Iran, at which point the consequences become very, very hard to predict.
Any other question? Comment?
On that cheery note, I see one.
Yes. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Ilyas Hussain. I am working here as a fellow. However, I am not an expert of foreign relations. I am a history student. My simple question is that once in Indo-Pak relation, Pakistan was important over India for American policy and strategy. Uh, in the new situation, how you see these, are these relations changing and how these are changing? Then there is hypothesis that whom America made his friend or ally is later left. Pakistan is actually left now by Americans. So did not India would be left at any time? This is my question.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, there are no permanent
Right.
friends, obviously, in
Right.
international relations.
Well,
I'm
one
sure.
thing I would say is that if America ever did abandon India, India would not be in the bad shape Pakistan is today. You know, Pakistan, it is absolutely true that the United States at this point does not think of Pakistan as an ally, doesn't, you know, we do not want, we are concerned about Pakistan's nuclear weapons. We're concerned at the signs that, for now, it looks as if the military is still in control of the weapons and in control more or less of the country. Although when you try to arrest somebody and you fail, that is not usually a good sign for state power. I would say that we would prefer there to even be a bad Pakistani government than to have essentially anarchy in a country with nuclear weapons. And I suspect there we in the Indian government are more or less on the same page. But the idea that in the future Pakistan would be a sort of, that the United States would see its relationship with Pakistan as more important than our relationship with India, I can't imagine that happening. And I think in general, the news that Pakistan has decided that China will be its best friend forever, you know, as far as I can tell, we in the United States wish China much joy with its new friend and partner. We're sure that they will make each other as happy as Pakistan has made us.
Well, Professor Mead, you made a very important point that as long as Putin and Russia think that China is less powerful than the United States of America, they will be with China. And of course, when they come to the conclusion that China has become more powerful than the United States, their position will change. Now, this comment of yours obviously in a way sums up the American strategy during the Cold War, by which it did not want the next two most powerful countries to be united against it, which is the classical balance of power strategy which Britain had followed in Europe also throughout the 19th century. Obviously, there was a fork in that strategy when Nixon changed his policy, American policy, vis-a-vis China. Because of the Sino-Soviet rift, it was felt by the American policymakers that now is the moment to take advantage of this rift and to move towards China in order to defeat the larger enemy, which was the USSR. So do you think that from the point of view of American foreign policy, you know, that India's, in a way, Nixon moment has arrived, or it has already arrived in the past? India is what it is. India has developed very fast in the last 30 years. China may have grown faster. India has also lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. In fact, since my student days itself, India has transformed so much in all possible ways, economically, technologically. I think the comparisons with China are not entirely fair. China had a different kind of system altogether, and we know the costs that China has played of development, both economic and technological. In fact, one-child policy also played a very important role in the rapid development of China because it changed the dependency ratio of its population. But China, in a way, is going to pay the deferred cost of many of its policies in future. So I think the Indian development has been very, very substantial economically, technologically, and India has become stronger mainly by its own efforts. Certainly, of course, countries, friends, allies have played an important role, and US has been one of those critical countries. But the point is, leaving all that aside of what India has done by its own efforts, from the point of view of American strategy, do you think that in a way India's Nixon moment has arrived, because now the combination of military power, US, China, Russia, India, it has developed in that direction now?
Well, I do think that one of the least controversial things you can say in Washington today is that developing a deeper relationship with India is profoundly in the American national interest. I don't know of anybody in the United States who thinks that's wrong. And actually, that's probably a sign that we're all wrong. No, but I do think that there's no one who's arguing against it. And this is true of the corporate world. I was talking to some very senior executives at Alphabet, the parent company of Google, recently. And I was asking them, well, you worried about China? And so they said, well, yeah, but, we have an answer to that. I said, what is it? India is what they said, both as a source of engineering talent, market, and, many other things. So that attitude, you would hear it at the Pentagon, you would hear it at Morgan Stanley, you would hear it in Silicon Valley. That's a lot of consensus. The question, and ultimately, India is in control of this because it's about India's growth and about the economic decisions that India makes. Does India really want to speed up its development? How fast, does India, how much of the trade that's moving away from China does India want, and is it capable of absorbing? And so those are the questions. India has probably now, more than at any moment since independence, its future is in its own hands. And so we are all, I think, waiting to see what India chooses to do. My sense is after my time here, I'm more optimistic than ever that India really, India would like to grow faster than China for the foreseeable future. And more and more Indians both understand what it would take to do that and are willing to start that process in motion.
I think the essential point that you are making here is that irrespective of the advantage to America of the cooperation between India and the US, the fact is that India is also going to benefit significantly from this cooperation, economic, technological, etc., and that is what matters ultimately when relationships develop, important relationships develop between two countries. Obviously, America will benefit, it has its own strategy, but India is going to benefit immensely from the relationship. Yeah, one last question. Be very, very brief.
Very brief. Sir, it is very difficult to understand rhetoric, reality, and narrative of the US. And I think one particular thing is also important, how to differentiate US administration and Biden administration. More than half of the tenure is gone without ambassador in India. And the name Eric Dassety, when came, this is the person which in public opinion is not a welcome name.
In India?
Yes, certainly. He has given statements which were completely domestic in nature. For example, CAA. And in Senate, what kind of statements has been given by Eric, that is also problematic. In spite of all this, after 24 months, Senate has decided to send him to Roosevelt House. So how could you say that Biden administration is thinking same as US administration, quote unquote, should think in the national interest?
All right.
Good question. I guess one of the things I would say is that India, first of all, I wish we had gotten an ambassador here early, but confirmation process in the Senate is always like this. In particular, we had a 50-50 tie in the Senate for the first 2 years of the Biden term. That makes everything move slower. Now that the Biden administration, now that the Democrats have even a slender majority, but a real majority in the Senate, actually the pace of many things in the Senate has sped up, including the confirmation of Mr. Garcetti, which you will see came soon after the midterm, the new senators were seated. So in that sense, I think it's a regrettable sometimes feature of the American system that we have these long holdups. But that's number one. Number two, and this is going to make a lot of ambassadors in America mad with me, but actually in these modern times, having an ambassador is not as important as it used to be. The entire complement of diplomats, of professional diplomats, was here. There was not a day when if the Indian government wanted to communicate something important to the United States, there wasn't a person ready to receive that confirmation. And so it's, the ambassador is, if we think about 100 years ago, when it would take a ship 6 months to get from here to Washington and back, and before there were cables and telegraphs, and the ambassador was there on the scene, that's a very different thing. Today, an ambassador has to get his remarks cleared by the State Department before he can give a speech. So it's not as important as it used to be, which is one reason that politicians are so happy to play these stupid games. Then as to whether, I have not read all of any of the statements that he made in his confirmation hearings, and I think there are certainly still contentious points in the U.S.-India relationship. I suspect the day he arrives here, he will begin a very interesting education in the realities of Indian politics and in the ways an American ambassador needs to conduct himself to achieve what will certainly be his goal. And let me finally just say that in many countries, many times we have political ambassadors who are friends of the president or political allies of the president. I've talked to countries where they don't get political ambassadors, and they're very upset because, when there's a problem, someone who is close to the president calls the White House, while a career diplomat calls the State Department. And as a country, you would much rather have your problem go directly to the White House than to the State Department. Ambassador Garcetti, whatever other things one might or might not think about him, is a very important Democratic Party politician at home who has strong support in California and will have the ear of President Biden and his senior officials. So you have an important ambassador. Beyond that, I wish Mr. Garcetti well as he begins his education in Indian politics.
Yeah. I think we have now reached the end of this program. Please be seated for a moment. As this has been a very, very interesting, useful lecture and a marvelous discussion on the subject, I thank all the participants for their enthusiastic participation in the discussion, and I extend again, my thanks to Professor Walter Russell Mead and all other friends who have come from the United States who are present here, and some of whom have also participated in the discussion. it is quite clear that the accounts of American decline, as Professor Walter Russell Mead said, are highly exaggerated. Of course, there may be a relative change in power structure in the world today, but the fact is that America continues to be the most powerful country economically, technologically in the world, and certainly militarily. And the important thing is that India has also emerged as a relatively more powerful country in the last 30 years, economically, technologically. And now, of course, India and United States need each other in their own right without any third party perspective. But the reality is that the rise of China is something that cannot be wished away, because it is not a peaceful rise as China had been claiming for decades. It is a rise that threatens its neighbors. It is a rise that threatens even countries that are far away. And the reality is that in that kind of a situation, relations between India and United States become even more important, and of course they are in the mutual interest of the two countries. It's not as if the two will come together to contain China, which he said is not going to happen, but certainly India has to build itself in this scenario, and US can play an important role in it. Ultimately, of course, every country stands in its own right by its own strength, but friends and allies are always important in international relations. So I think the future is going to be even better. Of course, in the last 8 or 10 years, India-US relations have improved vastly. So the third phase of India-US relations after the Second World War, which started, I would say, with the Prime Ministership of Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, it got another impetus after 2014, and it is likely to continue in future. Thank you very much. And I must say that we have tea outside.